Thanks everyone for joining. All right, we'll start the intro and then wait for other participants to join. I'm Joe Webby. I head up the Entrepreneur Residence Program for HAE. Today we have a very special guest. Feel free to ask your questions during the presentation and not have to wait to the end. We have about 35 minutes of presentation, and then it's open to Q&A. HAE is growing. We just launched a couple new chapters. So please, if you're not a member, do sign up. And if there's anything that we can help you with, do reach out to us. We do have some new episodes of our podcast if you would like to give it a listen on some of your favorite platforms. And if you're not a member of HAE Connect, please sign up. Our guest today, Molham Aref, is the CEO of RelationalAI. He has more than 28 years of experience in leading organizations that develop and implement high-value machine learning and AI solutions across various industries. Prior to RelationalAI, he was CEO of LogicBlocks and Predictix, Optimi, and co-founder of Brickstream. Molham held senior leadership positions at HNC Software, now FICO, and Retek, now part of Oracle. He received his bachelor's in computer engineering, MS in electrical engineering, and MS computer science from Georgia Tech. Welcome, Molham. Thank you so much for joining us.
All right, thanks, Joe. Thanks, everyone. As Joe said, I'd like for this session to be useful to you. And so if at any point you want to interrupt me, ask me questions, I would be happy to answer as we go, or ask you to wait patiently to a future slide where I might address your question. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen here. We can get started. And let's see if this still works. And
it's full screen.
Yeah, I'm going to now try to see you all while I see my slides. And most people don't have their cameras on, so it's fine. Okay, so again, the objective I have today is to see if I can help anybody in the audience benefit from the experience I've had helping build AI and machine learning startups over the last 30 or so years. I'll introduce myself very briefly. My name is Molham, as you know. My life experience has me living a life where I've been, had the privilege of living in many countries. I was born in Beirut, Lebanon, and my father at the time, and actually for the whole time, worked for a company called DuPont. And DuPont would ask him every 2 or 3 years to pick us up and move to the next country. So after living in Lebanon for about 7 years, we moved to Geneva, Switzerland for a little bit. And then they moved us to Cairo, Egypt. And then they moved us to Athens, Greece. And then back to Geneva, Switzerland. And then just in time for wrapping up high school, we moved to Hockessin, Delaware. Not far from DuPont headquarters in Wilmington, Delaware. Okay, and it was a very formative experience for me, exposure to different cultures, exposure to different languages, different ways of doing things. But at the same time, gave me visibility in sort of our common humanity and the fact that no country or no culture seemed to have a monopoly on all things good or all things bad. And it was very, very helpful in helping shape the way I view the world and the way we do business and so on. When I finished high school in Delaware, I decided to go to Georgia Tech in Atlanta, Georgia. The first time I saw Georgia Tech was when I showed up for freshman orientation. I majored in computer engineering as an undergraduate, and I spent 5 years there. A great experience for me. Got a lot of different experiences that were relevant, that were formative as well. Was thinking about getting a PhD and was doing a master's degree in electrical engineering, emphasizing or specializing in digital signal processing. And I was taking a lot of electives in computer science and ended up with enough credits to get a master's degree in computer science. But one summer, I took an internship with AT&T, and this is the summer of 1991. And if you remember 1991, for those of you old enough to remember 1991, it was a bad economy. You couldn't find a job. And after having a lot of fun in my internship at AT&T working on computer vision systems, way back then, they made me a job offer for, I think, a whopping $40,000 a year. And I decided to abandon my academic aspirations and quit the PhD and join because I was enjoying the work so much, and I wanted to keep doing it. Okay, and so this is the only real big company that I worked for throughout my career. It was a great from a technical perspective, but I learned early on that big companies operate at a different speed than made sense or that suited me, let's say. And after working there for a couple of years, I decided to leave to join a company called Heck Nielsen Neurocomputing, or HNC Software. So in 1993, I joined HNC Software. The N is for neurocomputing, like I said, and this was at the time when neural networks, for those of you who know machine learning, neural networks were making a comeback. The domain wasn't called machine learning back then. They were called neural networks or computational intelligence or data mining or database mining. We're making a comeback, and HNC was trying to commercialize this new technology. And initially, HNC was offering something called the database mining workstation, and they would go to banks and insurance companies and large corporations and say, yeah, we have neural networks. Do you want to buy neural networks? And would generally get blank stares from everybody as to what is a neural network and why would I want to buy it. And to the extent that anyone bought the technology, they bought it for 40, 50K, and they bought 1 or 2 copies, and it wasn't really meaningful from a business transaction perspective. And someone at HNC had this epiphany that, hey, instead of selling neural networks, let's just solve problems with neural networks, and we can sell solutions to those problems. And HNC picked a very interesting problem for the time, which was credit card fraud detection. This was at a time when credit cards were becoming more and more common. Everybody had access to credit through credit cards, or a lot of people did, and that was creating a lot of room for credit card fraud. People stealing your credit card or your credit card number, and then buying stuff with it, and then leaving you or the credit card issuer more typically, with the problem. So HNC shifted from saying, okay, do you want to buy neural networks, to saying, hey, to a particular bank, hey, you have a $300 million a year fraud problem. If you use our software, it'll be a $50 million a year fraud problem. And all of a sudden, the value proposition became very clear. Any banker can understand $250 million in their pockets, and business took off. And in fact, HNC did very well, basically became a monopoly in credit card fraud detection. I think at the time we had 23 of the top 25 credit card issuing banks in the US, and something like 87 of the top 100 in the world. And the 2 banks in the US that didn't use the HNC fraud solution, which was called Falcon, we're basically building their own. Okay. So flush with that success and sort of the combination of picking the right market, having the right value proposition, also a creative business model where we started a credit card fraud consortium and asked every bank who licensed our software to enter the consortium and commit their data exclusively to that consortium, commit their fraud data. So after having 2 or 3 or 4 banks, we had more examples of credit card fraud than anybody else. And so we could, in principle, build better models that could catch fraud more accurately than others. And that success sort of built on itself. And so in 1995, we went public. And it was at a time, it was pre-internet bubble, for those of you who remember the internet bubble in the late 90s. We had real customers, real revenues, real value proposition. We were in Time magazine that year, and this is the beginning of the ascent of Mark Andreessen, because at the time he was behind a company called Netscape that helped accelerate the adoption of the World Wide Web. Okay, so with that success, HNC decided to grow partially organically, partially by investing into existing businesses and so on, but also partially through acquisition. And in 1996, for about $50 million, we bought a small company called Retek. I think Retek had less than $10 million in revenue and less than 20 people at the time. It had a very interesting offering in retail. It was building a client server ERP solution for retailers a few years before Y2K. And again, it sort of picked the right technologies, picked the right movements in picking Unix and Oracle as platforms, and which helped Retek get picked a lot. Also picked the right partners. At the time, it was novel to partner with systems integrators like Accenture, and I had a very, very close relationship with Accenture that gave a small company like Retek access to some of the largest organizations in the world. So we bought them. We competed with PeopleSoft at the time to buy them, and we bought them with the view that we will embed this retail offering with a lot of machine learning and help retailers manage their supply chains and their merchandising with machine learning. Okay, and we did that reasonably well. And Retek ended up being the 800-pound gorilla of retail software. And we had most of the large retailers on the planet used our software in some way. And my daughter is practicing her piano. She decided to practice just now. So hopefully that's not going to be too much of a distraction. Anyways, Retek over time became so dominant, it became worth more valuable than HNC, and decided to spin out in its own IPO in November of 1999, which was also very, very successful. And even though, for the 9 years I was at the HNC and Retek, living in Atlanta at the time still, by the way, I was fortunate enough to be part of 2 very successful IPOs. And I think in March 2000, this company of 500 or so people had a market cap that was more, about $6 million. It was more than all the US airlines combined at the time, maybe minus Southwest Airlines. Okay, so very, very interesting experience, and learned a lot in terms of how to use machine learning technology to solve really hard business problems, and then how to use, how to combine that with a business model and a go-to-market strategy that made us successful. Okay, is that clear? Any questions so far?
Sounds great.
All right. So over time, well, the bubble burst, and but HNC and Retek were real businesses, and so the market consolidated. In 2002, FICO acquired acquired HNC for $810 million, which was a nice outcome. And actually today, for Isaac, FICO, a lot of the footprint at FICO is old HNC technology, or HNC technology that I contributed to developing. Okay, and at the same time, in 2005, Oracle and SAP made bids, different bids for Retek, and they had a bidding war where one would outbid the other, and eventually Oracle was able to acquire Retek for about $630 million. Okay. All right, so at that point, I'm like, hey, this is pretty easy. I can do this, and decided to venture out and start my, co-found a company. Went back to some of the early work that we did at AT&T in computer vision, and that technology had matured to the point where we could spin it out, actually, of AT&T, or at the time it was actually NCR. NCR has itself spun out of AT&T. And we started Brickstream with the idea that we will put computer vision systems inside brick and mortar retailers, and we will collect the same kind of data that retailers were collecting online. Okay, so online it's called clickstream analysis. In a brick and mortar environment, we thought we would riff on that and call it Brickstream. And the idea is that we would help retailers understand their customer experience in the brick and mortar environment as well as online. Great idea, but I think idea was a little early. And as we'll discuss later, early is indistinguishable from wrong. And it took a while to get retailers to see the value in this, and the technology wasn't quite that mature. It was still pretty expensive. It was hard to kind of affordably wire up an entire store, not to mention the thousands of stores that some retailers had to make this work in practice. So Brickstream, however, was able to to generate enough business to grow and stay relevant. At some point in 2014, I think the management team and the investors at Brickstream decided to kind of swing for the fences. There was a company in trouble called Nomi that was getting traction, but was spending way more money than it had. And Brickstream decided, okay, we're going to acquire this company, and together we're going to have a critical mass, and we're going to be able to go to market more effectively, and so on. And in fact, Brickstream rebranded itself to Nomi, and this acquisition happened. So really a fire sale, acqui-hire type transaction happened in October 2014. But unfortunately for the combined entity, the burn was too high, and the combined company itself had to be acquired by a company in Canada called Point Grey that was building the devices that Brickstream was using to do the computer vision. And because Point Grey had this hardware business and then had, was able to manage the burn better, they created enough value where they themselves were sold to FLIR for $253 million just a few months later. Okay, so it was a very interesting lesson in terms of doing 12 years worth of work to build all this IP and to build a basic value proposition, and then losing the discipline around the finances. So to have to give up control of your destiny to be acquired, and then someone else gets the value. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Any questions so far? Okay, all right. So before this all played out with Brickstream, I sort of saw the writing on the wall, and in 2003, 2004, somewhere around that time, I helped a friend of mine from college start a company called Optimi. And the idea there is we would apply machine learning to problems in the telecom industry. And this is at a time when the telecom industry was booming. It was making the transition from TDMA to GSM, from 2G networks to 2.5G networks and 3G networks. And these big providers were looking to spend billions of dollars on spectrum, on infrastructure, to try to build out these networks to capture market share. And the problem that they had is they didn't know how to spend that money. And what they wanted are predictive systems that were based on, again, what we today would call machine learning and AI, to help them predict what different levels of spend and investment would give them in terms of customer experience and capacity. Okay, and in this case, we had very sophisticated simulation technology that allowed the telcos to basically model out their networks, simulate the performance of their networks given variety of investment decisions, like buy more radios or less radios, build more towers, build fewer towers, buy this kind of antenna instead of that kind of antenna. And they could simulate what their infrastructure investment would give them in terms of capacity and user experience in a way that let them spend their money more wisely. Okay. And this company, instead of going out and raising capital like we did for Brickstream, we just bootstrapped. So with $300,000, we were able to get the company to the point where it didn't need any more money. In the first year, I think, of Optimi, we had about $750,000 in revenue. The next year, we did about $5 million. Okay, because we had picked the right trend, just like Retek had done and just like HNC had done. We picked the right trend and rode it. And at some point, we were decided to also follow the HNC playbook and grow via acquisitions, which ended up being ultimately very damaging in a sense. So we did the first acquisition outright. We just found a creative way of buying this group from Agilent Technologies. We did this other acquisition also outright, and those two worked. But the third acquisition was of a company in Spain, and we did it in a way that we basically acquired them with equity in a way that confused decision rights. So we had a management team that was made up equally of people from both companies. I was the CEO of both, and their 5 founders and one of my co-founders were all on the board. So the management team that I was leading were also, in effect, my boss on the board, and that created for some difficult dynamics. Okay, So I'm sharing this with you because I want you to benefit from this experience. I don't want to just give you the highlights. I want to give you some of the lowlights as well. And so that created some tension in the group. Eventually, though, we were able to grow the company. I think in the second year through acquisitions, we got to 10 million revenue. The third year it was about 20 million revenue. And at some point, we decided to part ways. I left to start another company that I'll tell you about in a minute. And ultimately, Optimi was acquired by Ericsson for $100 million. Okay, so still a nice outcome in the sense that $300,000 in and $100 million of value created, but not as good of an outcome, I think, as we could have had if we had managed our acquisitions the right way and managed our growth the right way. Okay, hopefully that also makes sense. Okay, and so Ericsson ultimately acquired Optimi for $100 million, like I just said. All right, so at that point, I had been doing machine learning in the enterprise or helping build companies that use machine learning to build high-value applications in the enterprise for 20 years. And it was obvious to me at that point that that's just a slog. It's too hard. It's very difficult to build these applications and to build it in a way where the companies can be profitable and have a compelling value proposition. So what I thought I would do next is build the technology base that would make building machine learning based applications easier. And we started a company called LogicBlocks, bootstrapped that and funded it with angel investment and got it going. And at the same time, a former colleague of mine from Retek, who had left after the Oracle acquisition, decided that he wanted to build a company that offered similar capability to Retek, but on the cloud using machine learning. And he wanted to use LogicBlocks as a platform to build out those solutions. Okay, and so this was a company that was called Predictix. Originally, we started LogicBlocks and Predictix independently with the idea that LogicBlocks would build the platform and Predictix would build the applications for the retail industry, and then one would use the other, and victory would ensue. The challenge there is after a few years of doing this, it started to become difficult to manage internally. If a new customer comes, should they be a Predictix customer? Should they be a LogicBlocks customer? If a Predictix customer generates X dollars of revenue, how much of that should go to LogicBlocks? How much of that should go to Predictix? It created frictions that were unanticipated that in the end we had to resolve by merging both companies. And that's exactly what we did in November of 2014. And it turned out to be a very good decision because shortly after doing that, the companies were growing throughout this time, but shortly after doing that, in 2015, we had a sort of unsolicited offer from a company called Infor to come in and buy the lot and buy both companies. And at the time, our revenues were something like $15 million of recurring revenues. And in early of 2016, we agreed to the terms of a transaction that closed in June of 2016, where Infor acquired the combined entities for $150 million. Okay, so anyways, this is sort of my experience at some level, different experiences, but at some level, the same experience. And at the root of all of it is that these machine learning based applications are hard to build, and it takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of people and in fact companies to build them. But if you can build them, you can create value for customers, and they will pay for that value, and that will create value for you as entrepreneurs. Okay, now right around this time, machine learning had its third resurgence. It started to be called ML and AI as we know it today, and some of the largest corporations or companies in the world decided that they don't want to buy these apps anymore. They want to build them because they started looking at Amazon. And to retailers, to many retailers, Amazon is really an engineering and data science company. and they use that kind of technology to build solutions to make them more, outcompete the traditional retailers. And instead of buying applications from a company like Predictix or a company like Oracle or a company like SAP, many retailers, especially the large ones like Walmart, like Home Depot, and like Target, decided to go all in building their own machine learning-based supply chain solutions and merchandising solutions. Similarly, in other industries, if you were in advertising, Google was having your lunch. If you were in media, Apple was having your lunch. If you were in transportation, Uber was disrupting you. If you're in hospitality, Airbnb was creating a problem. To all these sort of enterprises, they sort of shifted their mindset from one where IT and technology was side gig, and in some cases they were outsourcing it to other companies to do for them, to something they realized was fundamental to their competitiveness, and they wanted to get to the point where they were differentiating themselves with machine learning and AI. Okay, and so the pendulum swung away from people wanting to buy these apps to wanting to build them. Okay, at the same time, there was this realization, as I think articulated very well in this blog by Martin Casado and Matt Bornstein, who are in Andreessen Horowitz. This was, I think, a year and a half old now, where they started looking at their portfolio of companies, and they were investing in a lot of companies that were doing AI and machine learning, and they were looking at them, and they were looking at how much difficulty these companies had replicating the success of the software companies, the pure play software companies, the non-machine learning AI companies in their portfolio. And they noticed that AI companies in their portfolio had low gross margins. I don't know if you can see my cursor here. Because of heavy cloud infrastructure usage and a lot of people needed to maintain the models. They had scaling challenges because, again, it took a lot of labor to build models that adapted to everybody's business, because even though you might be selling to retailers, a retailer like the Home Depot is very different from a retailer like the Gap, who's very different from a retailer like Whole Foods. Even within a segment like grocery, you have different approaches to go to market, and it's very, very hard to build models that work for everybody. So they had to handcraft these models, and that created scaling problems. And then because so much energy was consumed doing that, these software companies, these AI, ML companies had very weak defensive moats. They couldn't really create IP that made them very differentiated, and a new company could come along and replace them. Okay, so this is a bit of an aha moment, I think, for Silicon Valley after investing for a few years in machine learning and AI, and looking at like, hey, these businesses look more like consulting businesses. They don't make that much money. They don't scale very well. They're not that easy to defend. Then they look like traditional software businesses. Okay, and that's consistent with my experience of these applications being very difficult to build because of these problems that Martin and Matt described in their blog entry. And so to the extent that you're thinking about doing something in this space, you should really, really think about that. Okay, I'm almost done here. I'd sort of built these companies outside of Silicon Valley. I'd mostly in Atlanta. I didn't have the benefit of the network here in Silicon Valley, which is where I am today. And I felt like, although we had good exits for most of them, we really still had a lot of unfinished business around really cracking the code on how to make it easy for people to use machine learning and AI in the enterprise. Okay, so I thought I had one more company in me here, even though this is a very taxing work, that hopefully will look at those sort of these 3 decades of experience and learnings and consolidate those learnings to build a technology platform that can really sort of change the economics of how people take advantage of AI and machine learning, and solve some of the fundamental issues in building systems that use AI and machine learning in the enterprise. Okay, so my latest endeavor is a company called RelationalAI. The idea here is that relational knowledge graphs, you might have heard the term knowledge graph here in the last 6 or 7 years, that relational knowledge graphs are the right foundation for building these applications, and that for these applications to be economically viable, you can't program them all from scratch. You have to be able to either learn them, leveraging all the great advances in machine learning, or declare them using reasoning capability, using old school AI, to where you specify what you want from the system, and the system figures out how to give you what you want. In a sense, they have to be automatically programmable, so that you don't have to do all the manual work that is required today in building machine learning systems. Okay, so still early in our journey. We're on year 3. We're having fun doing it, and we're very optimistic about our future, but still a ways to go. Also, to kind of another lesson learned here, instead of trying to do this outside of Silicon Valley, decided to move to the Bay Area. I'm actually I live in Woodside, 1 exit north of Sand Hill Road. And it's been actually, in hindsight, it was really a good decision. And in hindsight, I wish I was doing some of what I was doing before here, with the benefit of the network and the expertise and the access to capital that we didn't have, over the last 30 years. Okay, and so with that, I have a couple of slides that capture some reflections over lessons learned over the last 30 years, intended to be conversation starters, really. I can talk to you about, my experience with, capitalization and, sort of the doing it the scrappy way without a lot of funding versus, my observation of companies that were overfunded. I can talk to you about my exposure and the importance of frameworks and having clarity around team, selling. Anyways, I have 2 slides worth of topics here. I will let you look at them, maybe inspire you with questions, or if you have questions of your own, I'm very happy to take them and talk about anything that you find interesting.
Great. Thank you so much, Molham. That was really awesome. The story is amazing. And thank you for kind of taking us all the way back to the AT&T days and your inspiring story. So a lot of you that are on this call, maybe you're thinking of starting an AI startup, or you have one. Feel free to ask your questions here, drop them in the chats, or if you want to ask them live, just let me know. But I'll start off with a question, Molham. What is maybe the top 3 factors you would say to the success of an AI startup now, as opposed to when you first started?
Now things are in a sense, even though they're still hard, they're much easier, right? So back in the early 90s, at HNC, we had to, the HNC actually had its own hardware to accelerate machine learning to make it work in the context of credit card fraud and some of the other things that we were doing. So obviously cloud computing and GPUs and all of that change that dynamic. So it's easier for you, but it's also easier for everybody else. So I'm not sure that's a completely net positive. It's sort of more people can be involved in building AI startups. So definitely more and better hardware and computational power, more access to data at least in a lot of different settings. And people are now more aware of the value of data. So they tend to collect it more, they tend to curate it more. But again, it's not necessarily an advantage to you. It's a sort of, it's something that everybody can take advantage of. And more awareness of the value of these kinds of solutions. So probably easier access to capital. But again, having said that, the downside of all of that is that you have a few thousand companies now that claim to be doing something in AI and machine learning. And so your value proposition really has to stand out. And then you have to be, real in a way where people just don't roll their eyes at you and go, oh, one more company doing machine learning and AI, you and everyone else kind of thing. So easier, in some ways, but harder to stand out for sure relative to 30 years ago.
Definitely. I wanted to kind of go back to the first story you shared about the credit card fraud detection problem, and you're able to quantify it, you know, convince them it's a $50 million problem, et cetera. Now it's almost sometimes with AI solution, it's like a hammer looking for a nail. How do you sort of like quantify your value proposition, or how would you best frame it for those of us that are pitching to investors or trying to sell to the enterprise?
Well, I mean, I think that you have to answer that question very crisply and very clearly, or I would not, you know, I would not undertake the venture, right? It has to be clear to your customer what the value proposition is, right? So if you're in the enterprise space, you know, especially when you're selling to executives, it has to be something that would change the stock price of the company, or has the potential to, because the executives are basically compensated accordingly. And to the users of the software, it has to be something that gets them time. People are overworked and they have lots going on, and it has to be something that they, saves them time, and then they can, is transparent enough or proven enough where they can trust it. They can trust the recommendations that if you're suggesting a price change, or you're doing something that you know, is going to drive value. They need to know that you're doing it well on their behalf. And there are two types even in the enterprise. So there are things like recommendation systems that are running all the time, running at super scale, where every customer or every prospect of a retailer is going to be experiencing the recommendation engines. There's no way you can do that by hand. But then there are also solutions that are around merchandising, like what should be the assortment that the retailer carries, or supply chain, how to best deliver the product just in time, that that aren't, you know, you're not making million predictions a day, but you're making enough predictions where you can save the people at the home office a lot of time. And so understanding your value proposition to the supply chain people, or the merchandising people, or the marketing people, in a way where they can clearly see a path to them making more money. It just depends on the problem.
Mm-hmm. Is that what you meant by the high value applications where companies find it difficult to be profitable at that?
Yeah. So we you know, when we were in Predictix and LogicBlocks, we had Walgreens as a client, and they were using our system at the time to generate forecasts for every single item on their shelves for every single one of their 8,000 stores. So each store typically had 50,000 items. There are 8,000 stores, and they were generating a weekly forecast 52 weeks out for every item in every store. And small improvements in forecast accuracy can lead to hundreds of millions of dollars of value to them. So just by being able, I think they worked out that every % reduction in forecast error can reduce their inventory by like $100 million or something like that. I don't remember the exact numbers. Mm-hmm. And so if you look at forecast error, especially when they were promoting their product, like buy one, get one free, or putting a product on an end cap or something like that, we would see in some cases, because we were using machine learning, in some cases 15, 16, 17% reduction in error. And you look at a retailer that large, you can, and the amount of inventory they have to carry, you can easily see hundreds of millions of dollars of benefit to them.
I mean, we could probably do a whole session on just your experience in retail. And I love that list you have shared on the screen. So we'll get to that. But I wanted to ask a question around the data network effects that you mentioned from the Andreessen Horowitz article. How do you do it as a startup? We know like regular network effects. How do you, maybe some tips on building that data network effects?
Yeah, so not in this blog, but there was another blog, I think also written by Martin Casado, who said that, hey, you know, at some point you have enough data where more data doesn't really help you that much, okay? So it's not a foregone conclusion that more data gives you, you know, a moat. Like you need enough data, and sometimes, you know, getting enough data gets you to the point where you can solve a problem where others can't. But you also reach a point of diminishing returns. it's very hard to know a priori what that point is. It depends on the problem, and it depends on the models you're building and so on. So it just shouldn't be a foregone conclusion that just more data gives you a moat, but you need enough data to be able to improve the quality of the prediction to a point where you would make a decision more effectively and make money from making that decision more effectively.
Great. Before getting to the list, one more question about your point on large enterprises that are now building in-house versus buying from SAP and such. How easy or how difficult it is for these companies, and why are they doing that? It's not easy to become an AI company. Maybe how do we sell to the enterprise could be something helpful.
Yeah, so I think I feel bad for a lot of these companies because they have been captains of their industry for a long time, and these upstarts who don't necessarily know their industry that well, at least not initially, are using the fact that they can automate away some aspect of what they do, or just change the business model, change the way that the industry works. So they really don't have a choice, because if they can buy the capability from SAP or Oracle or from startup, that means every one of their competitors can do the same. Okay, and where's the competitive advantage in that? So they realized, and many of them maybe realized too late, that the innovation has to come from within. You can't outsource the innovation. So, my experience has been mostly around building these applications to sell to the enterprise, but it might be more profitable to build a technology that would disrupt those industries, right? And think through how you might take on these larger companies that have lots of money and have lots of people, but they don't have machine learning and AI in their DNA, and therefore can't move as quickly and can't really innovate in the way that you might be able to do. So it's either that, or build the machinery that lets them catch up, that makes it possible for them without the talent density that the Googles and the Amazons and the Apples of the world have, to be competitive and be innovative. So if you can throw them a lifeline, that would be, I think, good. Or if they're beyond saving, maybe compete with them, because you can rethink the value proposition to their customers in a way that lets you disrupt them.
And where does the relational AI fit into that now, and kind of looking forward?
Yeah, we're trying to do the former. We're building a knowledge graph management system that makes it easier for anybody, the startups as well as the big companies, to build these kinds of capabilities without having this low gross margin, scaling, weak defensive moats problem. So it's just too hard to build machine learning and AI systems right now. So we want to make it easier to build such systems.
Great. Going back to your slide and kind of your conversation starters there, I wanted to touch maybe on managing teams and remote work. So I know you've been working remote maybe before the pandemic, right? You have a distributed team.
Yeah.
How has that changed now, and what is your advice for those of us that manage remote AI teams?
Yeah, well, it used to be a real differentiator for us. And when I was in Atlanta, you certainly couldn't get all the talent you needed to build a world-class AI company just in Atlanta. Really, you couldn't do it in any one location. And so out of necessity, we discovered that we can hire much better if we let ourselves hire anywhere in the world. And so even though we were in Atlanta at the time, we had colleagues all over North America, in Europe, and North Africa. And we got really good at doing that before most people had cracked the code on it. More recently, especially with COVID, everyone has had to kind of get good at it. A lot of companies say that they're going to go back to office work when it's all over, but some companies, notably Google, just last week, said that there's no going back, and now they're going to be hiring, everywhere, and allowing people to work everywhere. And that's that's more, frankly, more challenging for us, because now we have to compete with Google for talent in places where historically we wouldn't have had to compete. So yeah, I would say get good at it. It used to be one of the things that startups could offer that big companies, didn't, and now some big companies are starting to offer it. So they offer the big salaries, the liquid stock options, the flexibility, the geographic flexibility. So you really have to think about, having a really interesting problem, really compelling idea that will attract the talent that will let you, implement your idea and ultimately build a big company yourself. So.
Great. Just to continue, I know Maury, you're next, but so you're one exit away from Sand Hill Road. How does your location matter in terms of telling your story to Silicon Valley and getting kind of that buy-in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, Silicon Valley has lots of pros and cons, but for someone who's built companies, technology companies the hard way outside of Silicon Valley, without access to expertise, most important, without the network effects, and without access to capital, it's been amazing to be here. Like when I lived in Atlanta, or I briefly lived in New York, the lot of people we would meet socially would be the parents of our daughter's friends, and they were lawyers and doctors and surgeons and dentists and people who work for large corporations. Here there are venture capitalists, people who are doing their own startups, people who are working for companies like Google and Facebook and Amazon and so on. So, beyond the obvious benefits, just being here is just from a network and access to expertise perspective, it's amazing. And I think there's a saying about, if you want to act, you should go to Hollywood, and if you want to be in banking, you should go to New York. I think there's a ton of value if you want to be in technology, and if you want to be in AI. I think at least spend some time here. You don't have to do it all from here, but spend some time here.
Awesome. Maury, you're next.
Thanks. Molham, really interesting stuff. I have a very early stage startup in London that's sort of somewhat conceptually similar to what you're doing at RelationalAI, that we're building AI infrastructure. We call it AI-driven learning infrastructure, that sort of a set of SaaS-based microservices to enable learning applications. And the question I struggle with is, this kind of toolkit could go a lot of different places, and it's a little bit hard to explain to investors and customers what the product is. How do you think about that? And in terms of, where you focus? Do you focus in terms of sectors or applications, so forth?
Yeah, I'm still a little old school here, but in the end, you need to get traction somewhere. You need to have a beachhead, and in the 90s, the influential sort of framework on this was the go-to-market framework, was crossing the chasm. And the whole idea there is you find an industry or a community of people where your value proposition can shine. You work with the early adopters in that community. You get traction with them. And even though the pragmatists don't necessarily listen to the early adopters, you work with the early adopters to figure out what the value proposition is, where the pain is, and use that as a beachhead. And then, that becomes where you're the foundation for your business. So I don't know enough about your business to advise you more concretely, but find a community, where your value proposition resonates. Also with investors, I think there are a lot of investors who invest, based on, business model or, financial model and things like that. There are fewer, but they exist, who can really understand your technology deeply and can invest based on the fact that you have differentiated technology. So, learn to qualify your investors in the same way that you qualify your customers. If you don't see, an investor really can grok what you do, I mean, part of that is on you, work on your pitch so it is grokkable, but also part of that is okay, and just find the investors that do understand. And I don't know what it's like in London, but I know that, here they have, there are VC offices in strip malls sometimes, so you're more likely to find a broader range of investors and people who might understand your business better than, being in a place where, you have fewer venture capitalists.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we're thinking along some of those lines. In London, the VC market definitely is a lot less deep than it is in Silicon Valley, and more risk averse.
Yeah, so more follow the herd, perhaps.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think, yeah, you're not for everybody, and you have to disqualify both from a sales perspective to your customers as well as to investor perspective. You have to qualify people out early, or you can end up wasting a lot of time.
Thanks.
Maury, I'll connect you with Simon Greenman from the HBS London Angels. He invests in AI startups at that early stage. So
I know Simon very well.
Oh, okay.
He's been an advisor to our company, and
Awesome.
yeah.
Okay, great. Karia Matre, you're next. Sorry if I butchered your name. Please go ahead.
Oh, no worries. Hello, thanks very much for the presentation, Aref. And my interests are specifically in the area of health, or the enhancement of health management. And I mentioned that distinct from medicine because medicine has a lot of regulatory constraints. And so that's where the two areas separate in that context. But I'm in the early stages of developing an AI ML system to track, document, and analyze individual patient/client health enhancement using historical and real-time data. So historical data could be anything from, say, for instance, DNA, like 23andMe sort of DNA database, and also real-time data, for instance, like Fitbit and Apple Watch, physiologic information and other information that can be captured from mobile devices. And so I'd be interested to hear any relevant insights you may have with respect to this space specifically, and also just in general, developing from concept to application, a particular approach, basically applying AI ML in a non-traditional space, or obviously with a likely disruptive effect.
Well, I think it's a very interesting area. I think that, for the most of the last 30 years, the kind of data that enterprises worked with was data that lived in databases. So it was structured data, relatively, easy to interrogate from a compute perspective. I think what you're talking about is being able to convert unstructured data or complex data, like data from documents, into something that a computer can work with, and then something that maybe you can build models with, and so on. So I definitely think it's an interesting space. I think again, I don't know, the distinctions. I put it all either healthcare, life sciences, medicine. You said not to call it medicine, right? But I know that that's an industry that needs a lot of help. Also know that it's challenging to work in that industry because, people move slowly and it's not always, competitive. And so there's less opportunity for them to move quickly, or they don't move as quickly because they're not as likely to be disrupted. At least that's the outsider's perspective on that industry. So that might be more challenging for you than working in industries where they feel a lot of competitive pressure and they have to try something new, or they're going to go out of business. So yeah, I think you're in an interesting spot. Do you have the right, like, do you feel like you have the technical innovation here that's going to make the translation or from the documents to the structured data? I mean, is there something that you feel is differentiated there, or you just have an idea and you're looking for a team to help you do the work?
Somewhere in between the two. So just a quick background. I went to Harvard undergrad, did a degree in medicinal chemistry, and did basically pharma style synthetic chemistry research when I was an undergrad. Went to Stanford MD PhD program in cancer biology, and I was at Stanford for about 11 years because I did research while I was in medical school there, but then I also did my training there in anesthesia and intensive care residency. And of course, anesthesia is super data intensive, and every 5 minutes you're tracking a set of parameters and making decisions in real time. as opposed to, say, internal medicine, which makes decisions over the course of, 6 week or 6 month spans of time. You get a prescription, you go home, and then you come back and they ask you, so how are you feeling, sort of thing. And so I'm very much data driven, and I know that medicine moves slowly, which is why I distinguish health from medicine, because health moves more quickly than medicine does. Even science moves more quickly, which is why you have things like translational medicine trying to bridge that gap. But medicine is a profession and it's regulated. So I regard medicine in general as being kind of like IBM and Xerox in the 70s, compared to Apple and Microsoft. And so the disruptive problem is that I see that, in fact, Google and IBM have made mistakes trying to cater to the medical profession as opposed to going around them altogether. Imagine if Amazon had tried to cater to Walmart and Borders bookstore and Barnes and Noble. It wouldn't have worked. There would have been too much resistance, just like Netflix saw with Blockbuster Video. But the approach is to basically recognize that humans are consuming and generating data full-time in every aspect of life, and the ability to then capture that data and process it into meaningful feedback to people, even something as simple as, say, stress level. And somebody's about to do say a Zoom presentation like you're doing, and with an app, they could check that, oh, your stress level is yellow as opposed to green or red. And if there are some interventions that this person knows that can improve that and take them from a yellow down to a green, they'll make a better presentation. And of course, if they're tracking in real time and maybe they do things like deep breathing or mindfulness or yoga, or they take, something like, CBD or whatever it is they may do, then they will also have historical information that they could draw on that could let them know, if I want to go from yellow to green without, falling asleep or dulling my cognitive performance, this is what's worked in the past. And so it's that sort of a thing.
So why don't we do this? That's obviously a lot to digest, but I've been helped a lot along the journey. And if you want to connect with me, it's my email is my first name dot my last name at gmail.com or relational.ai. I'll be very happy to dig in offline and see if I can help in any way. So, and for anyone else as well. So,
shukran.
Offline.
Thank you so much for that great question. Also, Molham, for sharing your contact. We definitely need to have you back to actually cover everything here that's on this slide. But in the last 1 minute we have, was there something that you wanted to share that maybe you didn't have a chance to from this list? It's really great. I mean, for me, I would pick business model. But is there anything that you really want to last words to leave us with?
Look, it's and I'm sure the audience knows, right? It's hard work, and do it for the right reasons. Don't do it because you want to do a startup. Do it because you're passionate about a problem, or you think that you can have an impact. It is, I think, a lot of people don't understand how much of a horror show the whole experience can be, and how many times you stare at the abyss, and how stressful it can be. Of course, it can be very rewarding, as you fight through it and you have success. But it is a tough thing to do. It's probably a 10-year commitment. If you're passionate and you're really excited about what you're doing, I think that helps you work through the toughness. Yeah, that's just I think probably understood at some level by everyone, but it is something I wanted to say, make sure that it's just not, don't do it just to do it because you're really passionate about it.
Great. We shared the link to your Twitter in the chat. And also, please, if you want to reach out to Molham, firstname.lastname@gmail.com. And tomorrow is the HBS Angels Conference. There's 2 codes there in the chat, Harvard 2021 or Student 2021. Do join if you want to try to raise money from the Angels. Thank you, everyone, so much. Thank you, Molham. And we definitely need to have you back to cover everything else that was on that list.
Thanks for having me. I hope it was helpful in some way. Yep.
Awesome.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thanks. Bye.